the gene that encodes for colistin resistance in pigs. These could have, if we'd done this early, we could have helped contain transmission. We just didn't find them till 15, 20 years after when they first emerged. And this is how we now do disease detection, which is, it's in animals, then it spills over into domestic animals, and then it gets to humans, and then it amplifies. We're trying to capture stuff only when it gets into that red zone. That's way too late. We should be capturing the stuff when it's right here. This is really where the real value comes. If you can show credibly that an Indian patient in Sweden is in many, many countries around an environment all over the place, which confers colistin resistance. But if you go back and look at isolates, it's probably there since the 70s already. So we don't really study One Health in this way at all. So there's a set of sites which are called indolent. So what we do is essentially are tracking people to look at what pathogens they have, what their health is, and so forth over a period of time. We just started doing this in a place called Nimai Valley, north of Bangalore. I'll show you a picture of it next. It's a catchment area that covers and would help sort of test interventions in a bed like this. And this is where we hope that India will host, or is already hosting, the first One Health demographic surveillance site.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramanan, for a wonderful and a very inference on topics related to One Health. So we start with the AMR is president of Gangajan Biotechnologies Private Limited. He is former executive director of AstraZeneca.
Thank you, Priyankana. And deal with One Health. Sometimes when I think about it, I just get intimidated. Anyway, we've got diagnostic for many years. She headed up the diagnostic division at GE, and I think you were in IBM before that. Yes. Got that right, please. Bugworks, founder of Bugworks, and as you know, they've got some really nice compounds into clinical trials. He's all it. He is. So that's the panel, and the way we're going to go through this introductions of ourselves, what background, as well as what we are doing and what sits to each of the panels and panelists. And I've tried to finish.
Okay, great.
And why AMR?
Why AMR? Good high-end, but can be used in places that are not high-end. So to make them accessible, affordable, all of these. Until a microbiologist who we were collaborating with told me, why don't you work on AMR? And I asked, what is that? This is a problem worth working on because of what it is doing is, we talked about NDM1. Now there are, I think, NDM1 to 30 variants, which has taught us many things, right from how to develop an AMR test, to try and sell.
And related to AMR?
Sure, thank you very much for the opportunity to attend the conference and participate. So, my name is Professor Christopher Mc. It's sort of a virtual, not actually virtual institute, it's an actual institute that brings together the university as well as challenges such as AMR. And so there's more than 300 people in our building that work on, I just had a massive investment from a international donor to try and help us build up capacity in developing pandemic therapeutics of this. So it's about identifying and the best way to intervene with respect to how we can best treat patients infected with AMR pathogens. So in terms of me, I'm actually a fundamental researcher. I'm really interested in understanding how pathogens cause disease within the host. I really want to understand how elemental aspects of disease, so metal ions, how are they important in terms of host-pathogen interaction? How does the host remodel its interface to try and make it hostile to invading organisms? And how can we take advantage of that against key gram-positive and gram-negative bacterial pathogens? And so for that, there's lots of assets. So Australian Pork Limited, the Australian Chicken Meat Federation, as well as the cattle industry. And it's really important, one thing we're learning through those lessons post-antibiotic era as we move forward, seeing what potential has to treat infectious organisms and our escape pathogens that we're particularly worried about through non-pharmaceutical interventions. And you'll hear a bit more about that technology.
Check you up a little bit. Why are we even talking about AMR, right? As a follow-up to Professor Ramanan's talk, right? Let's just understand how big of a problem. I think it's probably more. 7 to 10 lakh year on year to people who are dying in hospitals because this is very serious. In many parts of the country, we have lost most antibiotics, and BG was telling me that the numbers are 7. You run out of colistin It's game over for modern medicine. I don't know how to state this without sounding like I'm diagnosed and in that add up to that 7 to 10 lakh. It's not a COVID type of dramatic spread pattern, right? It's people dying an untreatable Klebsiella. This is why this is so meaningful a topic. My own background, and then spun out Bugworks in 2014. And the reason we spun out Bugworks is we started seeing the number of people dying in manufacturing. The big pharmaceutical companies left infection, numbers are rising. So we said, why don't we do a company from India that can invent the next antibiotic? Maybe it's passion, it's naivety, it's ignorance, it's a little bit of all of that. At the same time, AstraZeneca, that this man led, AstraZeneca India, which has spawned off more than 20 companies in India, had decided to move off from infection. And I was very blessed that many of the team that Balaganesh put together joined Bugworks. And we decided, and we said one last time in our career, we're going to do something. We're going to invent a new broad spectrum antibiotic that can help pneumonia, bloodstream infection, abdominal modeling and simulation. So a lot of bleed over of, semiconductor mathematics with microbiology, with clinical pharmacology. Many blind men and women trying to figure out the elephant. Maybe that orthogonal thinking helps. Maybe the non-science approach also helps. In 4 years we'll have a drug. But, we're taking AMR head on. Thanks.
Thanks, Anand. Briefly introducing my work. I head up the definition or classification that John Rex put together about 2 years ago, where he differentiated. See, the problem in non-traditional and traditional is, if you just say chemically one is small molecules and other antibiotics are more or less biotherapeutics being used for infection, like phages or phage-encoded products, antibodies, monoclonal antibodies, vaccines, and many immunomodulators all come under, whether they're small molecule or large molecule, as long as they're not bad. We have a product from a phage, specifically for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, which we've completed clinical trials in Singapore a couple of years ago. And right now we are also looking at a phage-coded lysine for the treatment of Klebsiella pneumonia. So that's the type of work that we've been doing. Now I have the privilege of coordinating this session for the next 15-20 minutes. Try to get some grants, international grants. And we had projected, for example, Klebsiella pneumonia is drug resistant very much in India. But it's not, fund something where it's not a priority problem. So what I want to know is, are we going to see, and maybe Lakshman was saying it's not, Ramanan was saying not, but is it possible that we're going to see that, India has, let's say, Klebsiella 90% resistance. So I have to find the funding mechanism for research on this. While most of the funding comes from the Western world, they're not worried about this type of a pattern. Are we going to see such demarcation? It brings back to, are we already funding enough to say, track such a problem? Very, very important question, delicate question, because pharmaceutical industry, BG, as you know, spends 0.5% on antibiotics. 0.5% of R&D dollars go into antibiotics. It's very low. And most of the funding that keeps companies like mine alive, and Gangajan. By the way, Gangajan and Bugworks happens to be the two lucky companies working on AMR from drug discovery perspective in India, in all of India, and Wockhardt. So it's 3, right? 2 small companies, 1 large company. So BG, the big funding mechanisms are Carbex, Repair Fund, GARDP, hopefully on the clinical development side. And leave GARDP aside, you and I are surviving because of Carbex. We would have closed our company if we didn't get Carbex. We struggled to raise funding. We still will struggle to raise funding. Slightly better now, 80 to 90% resistance Klebsiella. So BG, unfortunately, my answer to you is going to be brutally honest to say, we need to fix our own problems. Nobody is going to do it. So as part of people like you, Ramanan, others working with the government, we have to put dollars on the table. We have to treat anti-AMR like a defense infrastructure. Irrespective of how many cases you're going to use it for, you're going to spend money on a warplane or a warship, whether you use it or not, same way. And BG, really,
if you limited funding pools, naturally they will only fund those assets. So you are absolutely correct. We are a big country. We're entering the G7. I think we're the 6th largest GDP, thanks to the way UK has gone and thanks to the way we have gone, right? We have to fix our own problem. Nobody is going to drug discovery that is personalized. I use the word personalized or customized for Indian needs. Otherwise, companies like us will only innovate for the West. I'm sorry to say so, if I have to stay alive. So this is the brutal, honest truth. Customization required regio-specific innovation.
So are we in a position where diagnostics are going to be replacing our age-old way of doing things? Or diagnostics is an afterthought, or is it going to be only an ICU? What have you seen?
We have been in market. We have gone with our product to say that we can diagnose in 3 hours when when a culture takes 3 days, but to be very data. So the doctor wants it, right? On the other hand, we say we can tell you whether it is a gram-negative, gram-positive, or we can tell you very broadly whether it is carbapenem resistant or colistin resistant. Now that is actually enough to make a clinical decision, but a doctor is used to seeing a culture report with 20 antibiotics and the MIC listed. So that is a challenge in this situation, where the kind of information that a rapid test can give is different from what a culture test can give, number one. Secondly is price. A culture test is typically a lot less costlier. So what happened when we are in the market, when we are going to hospitals, the more rapid test comes to you actually pressed, you can understand what is happening. So we get transplant cases. By the time we are done with the diagnosis, they've either passed away or they're in a very bad condition. So will we replace age-old culture? I think there has to be a policy mechanism to say that, look, if a person comes with infection, you have to have a test. Today there is a test, for example, for TB. People cannot just give any antibiotic in TB, as you know, right? You have to have a confirmed molecular test based on GeneXpert or TrueNat or any other technology which says that you have TB and that you are rifampicin resistant or sensitive. But in the laboratories, people are used to culture, doctors are used to culture. The other funny thing which happens for us, or rather not funny but maybe sad thing, is if you look at it, we did a study on bloodstream infections, detecting 10 to 15%. So we said we'll be able to detect more. So what happens is, if you are detecting more, the question being asked was, you have false positives. So it is not that you are detecting more, you're finding the false thing. So we had a blood culture was negative, we were negative. So we're not detecting false positives. After that, we did a direct blood culture test. Then only we were able to pass this test of saying, look, if you detect too much, then are you getting false positives? The second challenge is also on the sample type. If you go to urine, urine has a lot of commensal bacteria. So if you detect it, is it really infection? So,
thanks, Sudeshna. Chris, my question, I've got some answers in Raman.
Interplay, the depth of interplay between climate change, what's happening in the context of these microbiomes, and how is that driving AMR? Because those are really complex questions, and to really do these studies thoroughly, you've got to collect lots of samples, do the metagenomics, and then also be tracking what's happening with the evolution of resistance over time. I mean, I would like to sort of point out, we have been doing that at a relatively simple level in Australia, working with some of our food producing industries, trying to understand what's actually happening in the context of AMR in order to see what's happening in animals in order to preserve them for human use. And so in Australia, what we've been done is we've done work with looking at the chicken meat, so the poultry industry, we've looked at the pork industry, and we've looked at the beef cattle industry, and doing antimicrobial surveillance with the third-generation cephalosporins, except in specific cases. Sometimes fourth-generation cephalosporins not used whatsoever. Fluoroquinolones not used whatsoever. And so gentamicin, not used whatsoever. And so that's the idea, that we're preserving in terms of what's being used in livestock and food-producing animals. What we're seeing actually coming out of the surveillance studies that we're doing, and pork is really interesting. We've seen that, unsurprisingly, if you look at salmonella and E. coli isolates, those particular ones, that was kind of already done. But what was concerning was we're seeing already low-level resistance to fluoroquinolones and third-generation cephalosporins. And then that's wheels. And it's a similar story in the beef industry. We're seeing that enterococci that are present in cattle, what we're seeing is, rather expectedly, we'd see that they're non-susceptible to a range. We're seeing, so VRE, we're seeing they've got resistance to fluoroquinolones. So again, this is occurring without any antibiotic selection things coming in elsewhere. So it's what's happening within Australia. We're seeing these resistance determinants appearing in bacteria. What this does highlight, the two take-home messages is we need to keep surveillance up, even in developed pharmaceutical solutions, to try and control what's happening in these environments as well. We need to really step up our opportunities in those spaces with technologies like smart materials that are good for disinfection.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, sorry that we have to close this discussion, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Balganesh. You need to rush to catch your flight at 6. So now we move to our next panel discussion. For this, I would like to invite Dr. Karthikeyan Vasudevan, who is scientist in charge.
Thank you, Priyanka. So, yeah, we've assembled here to discuss a very unique problem which has been highlighted by the speakers who came just before me, emerging zoonosis and climate change. So, where I come from, or my career has taken me to understand how free-ranging animals, those which are not tethered or maintained. So what this paper, which was published in Nature, and as we understand zoonosis, they are diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans, and they pose a very important threat to human societies. So what they said is this globally, and India prominently figures in that. Parts of the northeast of India were all red. So they also said that there is substantial risk of wildlife zoonosis and vector-borne EIDs. And then they go, it's 15 years since this publication came, and it required one massive pandemic that swept through the world, COVID-19, to remind us that we intra and intergovernmental cooperation were very obvious, and we have tried to meet them, and somewhat we have overcome them, and we have come out of this pandemic. Scientific experts from different fields have been warning us of climate change repeatedly, and they have been highlighting that we are faced with a very serious problem of raising global temperatures. And to face this challenge by complying to the emission standards. But the two put together is going to swing which way? Because neither we have a good hold of what would be the climate change, disease host pathogen dynamics, and survival of pathogens. And I have one of them to kindly come over and take your seat here. First, Abba Tiwari, emerging zoonosis. I will introduce you to animal biotechnology, and he's also responsible for creating a One Health platform. Dr. Ramanan Lakshminarayan, whom we heard a very eloquent talk just a while ago, is the founder of One Health Trust, and Professor Christopher McDevitt, who was there in the previous panel from Doherty Institute. Your focus on this particular issue, which is emerging zoonosis and climate change, and what is your take on it, and how your work has provided some insights into how we can, prioritize. Maybe we can go like this, or
okay,
would you like?
So just repeat the question.
Sorry.
So you want me to speak about
Zoonosis and the climate change.
Well, I mean, as I alluded to in the talk, there's many opportunities for human-animal interaction. Some of which are already in existence, which is simply the population using these animals in contexts which are close to human habitation, factory farming, and all of which could produce bird flu. Pigs carry, can have reassortment of interaction with wild species because of that pushing into these wild frontiers. You see that in the Amazon. You see that in many parts of India, and some of this is driven just by existing agricultural land becoming marginal or unproductive. In fact, in India, something like quite a push for agriculture to take on agricultural land. So I think all of these are not necessarily temperature related, but these are the sort of driving functions of the day. And I think at the bottom of this is the underlying factors that we sustain. But I don't think it was sustainable for the West to be eating meat at that same level, but I don't think we have the ability to produce that kind of animal protein. So these are all not necessarily climate, but they all contribute to climate, which then have feedback loops back into zoonoses.
Thank you. So I come from a climate science background, not from medicine background, so I can give you that perspective. So if you've been following the IPCC reports, you'll see that IPCC has been very emphatic and has been emphasizing in very strong words that our region of the world is contributing. The effects are going to be globally distributed. So post 2015, the change in approach, initially the approach of climate community was on mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means you bring down the emissions so that you try to bring then contributes to a relatively lower increase in temperature, and then adaptation, because no matter to what degree you reduce the emissions, but the emissions which are there in stock in the atmosphere, it is going to take a lifetime. Whether you talk of carbon dioxide, or you talk of methane, or you talk of nitrogen dioxide, whatever GHG emissions you have, they still have a stock and flow balance, and because of their lifetimes, few decades. From MDGs, we've graduated to SDGs. We've sort of expanded our focus more to include not only health, not only biodiversity. We are also thinking of sustainable consumption. We're talking of sustainable production, because overall, the approach is that we are living in a planet which has got limited resources. We have outlined certain planetary boundaries, and like what we've discussed so far, that the biodiversity boundary has already been crossed. We have, even if you look at India's contribution, we have 8 nationally determined contribution, of which only 4 are quantified goals. Rest all are based to adaptation. Some are conditional, which are based on subject to international aid being available to us, subject to finance, capacity building, technology support that is available to the country. So the IPCC analysis latest, it says that even if all the commitments, conditional as well as unconditional, are met, even if all the net zero pledges that were made till now, post 2015, are met, still we are heading for a future which is somewhere about 2.7 to 3 degrees Celsius towards the end of the century. It has an error of plus minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So a brighter side is 2.2 degrees. The worst case scenario we're seeing is 3 degrees. So it's not a very promising future. Now, if you look into, see what are the factors, we are looking for higher temperatures, we're looking for extreme weather events. Extreme not only in terms of frequency. Frequency means the number of events are going to go up. Also in terms of intensity. So the events are going to be even stronger. So you have a cyclonic storm, it is going to be more intense. You have a heavy precipitation, it is going to be very intense. And if we just have a look at, the recent weather events we've seen Bangalore flooding, we've seen floods over Himalayan states, so it is right in front of us, Now, you weave climate change with now the climate risk. We actually stopped calling it climate change. Now we started addressing it as climate risk, as Dr. Ramanan. That segregation between hazard to risk, we have already reached the stage where we are calling climate change as a risk, and it is a threat multiplier as far as the other thematic areas or other areas are concerned. So you have a risk, it is a threat multiplier, so it compounds the risk which is pre-existing. So let us take the example of cyclone Amphan. We have, at the peak of COVID, we had a cyclone which had hit Odisha, and the NDMA for the last few decades was credited for their handling of evacuation efforts, and the number of fatalities from that super cyclone we had in the early 90s, ranging to death figures reaching about 1 lakh, was brought down 10,000. The evacuation efforts were so good, and then we were dealing with figures which are less than 10. But with Amphan, you have a huge evacuation from the, where the cyclone was going to make a landfall. But then the biggest challenge was you had COVID in place, but your infrastructure for it. And are we prepared for us as it is if you assess the public health infrastructure that we have in our country? There's a lot of room for strengthening it. The national government is putting in efforts, but you put on it overlap a pandemic, and then we realize that we are spread so thin. So I think in terms of the way the climate is going to change the profile of your your spread of zoonotic disease. So the existing epidemiological profile is going to change. The projections are strong national strategy to basically translate it. We need a strong framework to, outline into, when we talk of today, we are not talking of mitigation, adaptation in climate change domain. We're talking of building resilience. We're talking of systems approach. We're talking of critical infrastructure, because when you have, say, suppose a flooding incident and you impose on it a threat multiplier as climate change, so your flooding is going to be erratic. So the aftermath of the flooding, the direct and indirect impacts on health, your critical infrastructure in itself is going to get impacted because of climate change. Your access to roads, your primary health, your supply chain, everything is going to get disrupted in face of climate change. So have we catered that? I think we need to realign the strategy, think of overlapping climate change as a layer over every risk that we perceive currently. So we don't have a cooling. We're not looking ahead into a cooling future. It is a warming future we have ahead of us, and we need to plan for it.
Thank you, Abba.
Yeah. So I think most of it is covered, and I will just give you the glimpse of what really climate change has really affected, and it's all human-made from the ages old, and we understand what we do to the climate and what changes are occurring can now be read with greater machineries and a lot of data, but that data needs to be really collated well to make out a meaningful output of it. That's very, very important. And we all know that if there is a little temperature rise, and we know that from a low altitude, the vectors will try to move towards the mid or lazy virus and meninggal virus. It's only because of the deforestation and the bats have kind of ventured into it, so animals and human both became responsible for it. And if there is a dry season which is ending and a rainy season is starting, Ebola has been increased, it has been seen, and it's also found the antiserum activities in bat has also been detected. And leishmaniasis vectors, mainly because of the gonotropic cycle and of the vector and the female body. There were only 9 countries with the dengue fever endemic, and now there are 100 countries. So it's all related to global change and very clear. And I would not talk a lot about how the climate, we must focus on the regional climate change. So let us take India. It has got extremely variant agroclimatic conditions, starting from Himalaya to very rainy areas in Assam, and then central India, and central and western India, very dry. And so if you really want to have a real glimpse of what is happening because of climate change, you must have a strong group of people who should be addressing this. For example, what we started, we have 27 centers across the India. We have involved medical colleges, AIMS Delhi, AIMS Jodhpur, like that, several places, all major veterinary colleges, and also the wildlife, 2 centers of the wildlife. So they are in the north, east, center, mid-east, every part of the country. There should be a common working pattern. There should be booting camps. They should become friends of each other. They should know, there should be a common website that what they have to fill in. So they have to not fill in that in my hospital I have found 3 cases of, for example, any one of the zoonotic disease, let us say, and I will not name any, and let us say we go to Rajasthan and say CCHF, and then say what are the risk factors we at the same time. Is it a rainy season? Is it very humid or dry on that particular month? And why it has come to human? There may be times when it was, the veterinarians can say, no, it is only in the animals. This year it didn't jump to humans. So you have to find out what were the risk factors for animals, but not enough to jump to. And also epidemiologists, in addition to veterinarians, wildlife people and medical people, so that you map exactly that in a particular region, because zoonotic disease, we call it emerging zoonotic disease. What emerging means, it emerges from one place. So instead of talking only global change, we must immediately recognize. I think this whole topic of One Health should be divided and categorized into 3 important things. One is epidemiological survey and disease forecasting. There should be a group of people who will be working only on this, which includes diagnostic of disease. And second should be preparedness and response. All of a sudden if something happens, are we prepared? Third is ability to develop therapeutics quickly, as we did in case of COVID-19, vaccines, etc. And these 3 groups of people should be different. And climate change thing will come with the epidemiologist, and that should be centralized in my view. And I think for these medical doctors, wildlife practitioners, vet practitioners, climatologists, there is a lot of climate change because of the aggressive agricultural practices. So the manures you add can raise ability of the microbes to grow. And animal as well as human both feed on those microbes when we take the vegetables.
Example of a situation where we've had an emerging zoonotic disease that's been linked to climate change in Victoria. And this is work that was done in the Doherty by my colleague, Professor Tim Stenier, which was to really to having nearly 300 cases a year by 2020. And so this disease essentially came out of nowhere under your skin, starts to secrete toxins that break down your fat cells under your skin, and you get this really sort of cosmetically unpleasant looking ulcer that can be very difficult to treat and very sort of transmit between people directly. So it was coming from somewhere else. And this was really an engagement with citizen science, tracking down, looking at what the possible Australian possum population. So with Australia, all our native species are protected. So we live cheek by jowl with possums in the trees, flying foxes around the place, kangaroos, obviously in that environment with animals. And so it was speculated that maybe interactions with possums could have been the cause, but there wasn't enough people actually getting exposed to possum fecal matter that you could think where these infections were coming from, because it always seemed to be associated with getting coastal erosion and increased rainfalls associated with this region because of climate change. And that's when people realised that perhaps there was another vector involved, and sure enough, it turned out to be that mosquitoes were the primary source. Mosquitoes were biting possums and then flying around and then biting a person. And that was the primary vector for transmission. Treat it with a combination of rifampicin and clarithromycin, but it can take up to 6 months of continuous antibiotic treatment in order to effect a cure. And some of these deeper, sort of larger abscesses can actually require surgical intervention. And so rapidly developing, break that chain of transmission. Can we vaccinate possums to make them not carry the disease? Can we try and treat the mosquitoes, trying to wipe out the mosquito population and try and break cycles of transmission? That's where we're at the moment. But the key thing is here, this was really a community effort, sort of test case for where we've seen both a combination of climate change driving a zoonotic pathogen into the human population.
Thank you. I think these are all great points. I think takeaways which I thought I'll share with the audience. Like by addressing the issues of moving from place to place and new pathogens emerging while they were not pathogenic, now becoming pathogenic. And from what Ramanan spoke about, it looks like if you have solutions for better farming or replace, so there seems to be some connection there, because I think the major source of methane comes from farm produce. So if we do find replacements for substitute vegetarian substitutes for animal products, so I think we can find solutions there. And what Dr. Subir was mentioning about vectors moving, that's very, Chris clearly outlined a fantastic case study where tracing one pathogen to a possible vector and an animal host, which plea that Jones made 15 years ago, still valid, that we need to invest more in trying to find out how the pathogens are moving with the vectors or without the vectors, and how we are becoming more and more susceptible.
So thank you so much, Dr. Karthik, and to all the panel members. It was a
so I will actually call my panelists right now to the stage. Let's make it a panel discussion as we would like to. So could we have our panelists? Anu? She was here somewhere. Oh, there she is, yes. Dr. Vikram Gopal, I never got to meet him actually. We will meet him now. And Dr. Rakesh Mishra. We have two mics that work, right? Okay, so then I'll just sit there because I'll have one. I'll just sit here. If there is one more, yeah. The best way I figured would be to have a panel discussion is audience will find it interesting. So it's a fairly simple philosophy. Now, just to set the context, because One Health, I've been part of this field for now more than a decade, or even before, because I was trained as a meeting, call it One Health, people would hardly show up. And COVID changed that. So much so that I cannot make a turn and not hear One Health. And now we have the problem of the riches. That is lack of an operative definition, because when you look around the definition, it is everything. Build strategies and build solutions. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm just going to define it as addressing infectious diseases. AMR got covered, so we don't need to keep rehashing it. So when I say infectious diseases, we are now talking about diseases. I would just categorize as zoonotic diseases, meaning diseases that somehow impact humans and have some other compartment involvement, and so-called transboundary animal diseases. These like foot subcategory, which is diseases of epidemic and pandemic nature. So that's our scope. And to address those, we need a disease control strategy. And we need to know where the diseases are spreading, how they're spreading, etc. That's integrated disease surveillance. I use the word integrated because we want to take into consideration these compartments. And outbreak response, so even with your best efforts, which was the source of it, and the insurance policy costs far less than when we just try to address it. But pandemic preparedness in and of itself is not really going to stick, and we are already stopped wearing masks, and 6 months. Thankfully, these phenomenal moderators, I didn't put it together, but they happen to complement various aspects of this cycle. So I would like to just now, I'll start with the prevention side. Like one of the most useful and dominant preventive solution is vaccines. Now, one of the problem is that to develop or it's in a small footprint like CCHF. Unless you are in this system, you wouldn't know what that is. KFD, like 20 kilometers from my hometown, Casnur Forest, you wouldn't know if you didn't know that. But it's a matter of time. They prepare for these at the R&D side when there isn't a market, and as a private entity, that's not something investors would be, going gaga about and putting money about.
I think fortunately they believe what they believe in, they execute. That's what we did. But I think, we took a strategy decision right from the beginning, 20 years back. We want to be niche over the multinational. The only way to be niche is the neglected disease. I'm a strong believer, all neglected diseases turn out to be mostly in Asia and Africa. Every disease was neglected before, today turned out to be global pandemic. So we took the strategy decision right from the beginning. Covaxin has not come by an accidentally. We have amazing background before. So we were the first action, which again I found neglected, will turn out to be a pandemic in 2014. By 2015, December, pandemic in Brazil, and pandemic flu we made. So I think, I'm able to begin it. Pandemic, you cannot act once pandemic comes. When you start acting, then never succeed. That's how many countries fail, because they couldn't succeed to make it happen. So you need to have a strong base of R&D and focus on neglected. For a particularly like India and Asia and Africa, really should focus on a neglected disease. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add ask one more question and then...
So has to change quite a bit. Whether it is... we try to, when something you want to innovative in India, we are more regulated than the other. So when you have a good science and a good technology, and we are still follower of, we need to move ahead of the other part of the world, we need to take a leadership role, that strategy thinking should be there. They suspect industry is going to do something wrong. They're going to kill the people. I think we are the last people to kill anybody in the world, because we are the commercial company. We are more conscious than the government. Bottom line. As a private company, okay? So I think that's, okay, they have to look at a global picture. So we are not looking at a global picture. So we always, you have to do preclinical toxicology for 1 year, and you have to do phase 1, you need a phase 2, you need a phase 3. Whereas monkeypox vaccine in US, not even animal, even mRNA vaccine in US, no animal challenge studies, no monkey study, no preclinical toxicology, entered directly into phase 1. Whereas India, no. So they suspect that Indian innovation is a belittle, and you put down and put more regulation, not less regulation, more regulation. I think that
and also is related to is the other side of the either prevention or diagnosis, both. How do we think about this from a device perspective? And device is a very broad word for me.
So all the discussion we've had so far has talked about the fact that there's an antibiotic resistance that's building, and I know you don't want to necessarily talk about AMR, but you can't prevention side of it. What you have, what is the mechanism and what is the organism you're dealing with, and to do that you need a broad spectrum antiviral or antibacterial type of product, which is self-cleaning. That's one aspect that becomes an important part, and we've been focusing a lot on that. And that's why we've been working with Dr. McDevitt and Dr. Velthius, just to say, do we understand the fundamentals of how this works? And how do we do the forms? Because you don't know what type of end form do you need. Do you need it in masks? Do you need it in PPEs? Do you need it in shoes? Or, and what do you need? So you need something which is easy and scalable. That's what we've been focused on. Innovations, so that you can actually make devices out of it. So if it turns out bioaerosol is a problem, which it is, when you think about all the infection spreads, how do you actually get to a point where you can actually have a device that can actually do the cure so that you can keep the environment clean? That's what we focused on.
That's a very interesting, that seems so simple, can become bottleneck. Now, from a fundamental principles standpoint, for something to become really logarithmic rise and a pandemic, respiratory route is by far the most common one. And if I tell you the next pandemic is likely to be respiratory bond, and it's not like it's an aha moment or anything. What do we do now? Now from a thing in the horizon there. And second, same question that I was asking Dr. Ella, where do you get the funding? Because right now if you make it, who do you sell it to?
Again, great question. So the number of outbreaks has gone up 5x. Okay? If you look at the types of, what are the organisms that cause it, 90% of them are either bacterial or viral in nature, out of which 60% are zoonotic. Okay? So when you now look at this, that trend is not, we can work on other things, but this is the main route and this is the main thrust. So as a CTO of a company, it becomes rather critical to have these multi-generation product plans so that you actually got platforms that you're looking at what is coming next and how can you be ready for it. In Jan of 2020, where the polymer was already scaled up, we knew what we needed to do. And then I was in India because my father had unfortunately just passed away. And I was looking at the China situation, and we didn't know how we can utilize our material. And it turned out to be very, very helpful, because in the meanwhile, I had really great colleagues and really great collaborators in Dr. McDevitt and Dr. Veltius, because they did everything they could to actually take the material approvals. That's a whole different piece. We can do all good science. The regulatory science is a very different science, and it takes time anywhere. India is a bigger problem, but West is not as easy as well. But the thing though is you need to kind of base it on where the trends are and getting ready for it up front.
What can government do better to help you with the ecosystem?
Okay, now in the US today, just think about it, just before the pandemic, the national stockpile program was neglected to a point where there were not enough N95 masks. There were not enough PPE, and then there were not enough nitrile gloves. Those are all problems, and suddenly we realized it, and there was an issue. And by the way, initially what we were doing is we were helping our Chinese counterparts. And the thing what you got to do is, much like we have the oil reserves, we need to have stockpile programs so that you can actually have these, have critical pieces and PPEs, pieces stored in forms that you can do what you need, so as to get ready and give our friends on the vaccine side enough time to develop. Because it's a synergetic thing. It's not one or the other. We need every one of these.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point, actually. Continuing the thread, in this cycle, surveillance is a very critical part. Dengue or in animal diseases. Now, when I think of surveillance, information comes from different sources. Or they get care for their animals, or forest guards going around and doing their thing. How do we harvest that information? They're not doing it for disease surveillance. They're going about, and actually that is the richest and believable information. And the second one is actually active or passive surveillance done for surveillance.
So thank you. I mean, it's you just heard in the keynote address as well, and now it's very common knowledge that probably environmentals also in Bangalore for almost 1.5 years now on a weekly basis we give information to BBMP in which ward how many cases are there. I mean, and the sensitivity you will pick it in there. So it's amazing. So in fact, what we are thinking now is how to implement it as a routine thing of every city to collect sample with what frequency, and then doing the molecular biology of that, isolating it and establishing whether for a specific pathogens, or you can have a panel of pathogens or certain frequency strategy that had to be put in place. For instance, at what frequency, in which year, and what is the correlation with other vectors and other aspects. So there are many aspects. Now most of the places we do is manual, but it can be automated, and we need indigenization of them to be used by every municipality, every small city on a regular basis. And the other component which we are doing in next 2 years, we are going to establish all this is to train the human resource of entrepreneurs who are now willing to offer, who are going to test and give you the data. And then they can be also done the genome sequencing, and you can actually, we have been knowing which kind of variant is coming, not individual basis, but what % of variant in which part of the city it is. And then we should not be afraid of the information which is very important. Right? So we should not try to hide it. And this, I think, we have learned the hard way in this pandemic. And as a policy, we should make it really something like people deserve, or they have the right to have the information.
Yeah. No, I am a big fan of surveillance techniques that are not people dependent. People may refuse to share their samples, but they can't stop going to bathrooms, and you will pick it up. But I'm not going to let you off that easily. So I see a problem. That is, I have no doubt that you will pick up 25 pathogens of interest in the...
Keep giving to researchers who will generate models, who will put the trend and will generate predictions, and which will be very, very useful. And it also depends on the first user of the data, which is the municipal body. And I will put on record the appreciation of the BBMP that each ward, when we
Karnataka,
Bangalore, like GHMC here. Yeah. So when we have picked the peaks during, like, say, Dashara or later parts, certain parts which did come in the news, but then they go and take action and figure out whether it's the human behavior or a new variant is appearing, because we have the variant data as well, and they take appropriate action. In fact, they keep telling us, now you use this pathogen also, you tell us about dengue and many other things. So there are users immediately, actually. So if we keep doing... See, the city knows if you know 10 cases, which means there must be at least 100 or 1,000 cases, because people don't number. So we will have the exact situation, which will be useful not only for city authorities, but the healthcare system as well. And then once we have generated the data and it is being modeled, so they are the final users of this. But I think there should be a cycle that the circuit, in the sense that data is generated in the lab, given to municipality first for immediate action, given to researchers for making it and generating models, analyses, and preparedness for, and it will of course depend on different disease in different ways.
Right. And how do you stitch those priorities of different diseases into a coherent program is where the trick is. So I would like to come to you, because what Rakesh was talking about is at a population level. And so now my questions are twofold. So where do you see role of private sector in this? I am struggling with this.
Sure. So I think, when we talk about One Health, it's also one's health, right? And when it comes to one's health, you're looking at understanding...
That's a good slogan. I'm going to copy it and...
study, right? Understanding what is going on with that individual. But I think, at the end of the day, your own genomic data is your data. But as a citizen, if we can encourage people to be able to share this in a bigger platform that maybe can be enabled, then I think we get better and more smarter trend. A particular kind of disease or something like that. I think that information can, and how do we encode, we can actually ultimately see that. So that microbes and viruses and other things inbuilt into a system. So whether it is understanding of the microbiomes and others also is an interesting part to be able to understand overall, the One Health problem that we may face in the future. The second question that you asked, which was, how do we understand what do private players have to do with it, right? So one is that, in the case when COVID was going on or other things, people might be interested in sequencing their sample. There are curious people across the country. So you can take those samples, make sure you sample, create a commercial model that will allow commercial companies to sustainably do something like this, but also incentivize us to be able to then share that data. Unwell, I think, or something happens from an infectious disease level, I think ultimately it will spread. So I think we have to do each other with suspicion that we are doing something.
And this information should be available to product developers too. It actually helps everybody. And by holding that, we actually are